Hitler's stolen treasures. Where did it go? You know, when we talk about Nazi plunder, the image is usually singular, a train, deep in a mountain, packed with gold. We imagine the Third Reich as this monolithic state, efficiently cataloging its loot. But honestly, that image is a myth. The reality is far more complex and in many ways, far more disturbing for anyone studying collapse and survival. The misconception is that the treasures of the Reich were lost. But really, they weren't lost. They were launched. The final days of the war weren't just a military defeat, they were the largest, most chaotic asset dispersal operation in modern history. As the Red Army tightened the noose and the Western Allies pushed east, the men running the apparatus, the Gauleiters, the SS industrial barons, the local party chiefs, weren't thinking about a 1,000-year Reich anymore. Nope, they were thinking about a 30-year retirement. The treasure we imagine, the single hoard, never really existed. What existed were thousands of individual caches, bank accounts and art deposits, seeded across what would become East and West Germany, Austria, and beyond. The real story isn't about finding one lost train. It's about understanding how the assets of a failed state were systematically fragmented and laundered into the post-war world. And, honestly, it's a story that reveals the difference between a military defeat and a financial one. So, to understand where it all went, we have to first understand the machinery that took it. The looting wasn't just random street crime, it was in fact a state-sponsored industry, divided into competing fiefdoms. The Rosenberg Task Force stripped Jewish homes and libraries of their cultural soul. Hermann Göring, a voracious collector, had his own personal train to cherry-pick the best pieces for his estate, Hall. The Wehrmacht took what it needed for its troops, and the Reichsbank took the gold. By early 1945, this river of plunder, paintings by Vermeer and Rembrandt, gold from central bank vaults, dental gold from the camps, had to be moved. The Allies were bombing the factories and the transport hubs. The solution was, well, the earth itself. The Nazis turned to the mines and tunnels of central Germany and Austria. The salt mine at Alta Sea became a vault for masterpieces, including the Ghent altarpiece. The potassium mine at Merkers held billions in Reichsbank gold, but these were the official caches. They were the ones the Allies found, the ones General Patton and Eisenhower walked through in April 1945. The harder question is what happened to the rest, because as the official state collapsed, the initiative shifted downward. Gauleiter in the eastern provinces, knowing the Soviets were coming, didn't ship their loot back to Berlin. They buried it in the forest, sunk it in lakes, or loaded it onto ships heading west across the Baltic, gambling that a sympathetic port would take them. One of the most persistent threads in this story leads to the bottom of the Baltic Sea. In January 1945, as the Red Army pushed into East Prussia, a massive evacuation by sea began. Among the ships involved was the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. Officially, it was a passenger ship evacuating civilians and wounded soldiers, but survivor accounts, analyzed by divers like Phil Sayers, suggest that in the chaos of the Gotenhofen harbor, a specific convoy of trucks pulled up to the gangplank. These weren't carrying civilians, they were carrying high-security cargo, crates that guards later intimated held bullion. On January 30th, the ship was hit by 3 Soviet torpedoes and went down in under an hour, killing an estimated 9,500 people. From a survivalist and logistical standpoint, this is a critical lesson. The Gustloff represents the danger of a single point of failure. If you concentrate your wealth, your escape assets, on one platform, you risk losing it all in a single catastrophic event. The gold on the Gustloff, if it existed, wasn't lost because of a bad investment. It was lost because the strategic situation collapsed faster than the ship could sail. The debris field at the bottom of the Baltic isn't just a grave, it's a monument to failed extraction. While the North was about desperate evacuation, the South was about a planned last stand. The concept of the Alpine Fortress, a redoubt in the mountains of Bavaria and Austria where the SS would fight to the death, was largely a propaganda success. It fooled the Allies into slowing their advance. But it also concentrated the remaining Nazi hierarchy in that region. Men like Hitler and Himmler retreated to Berlin or the north, but the secondary and tertiary figures flooded into the Austrian Alps. This is where the loot fragments, the salt mines at Altusay, weren't just storing art, they were actually a hub of activity. But as the end neared, SS units and local Nazi leaders began, well, denazifying their treasure. Paintings were removed from their frames and hidden away in walls. Gold was melted down into anonymous ingots. This was the shift from state property to privately held wealth. It wasn't about funding the Reich anymore, it was about funding the escape. The so-called rat lines that would take men like Adolf Eichmann to Argentina. Recent investigations into Swiss banking archives, which are set to be released in full as of the year 2026, are really pulling back the curtain on this financial transition. Forensic accountants are analyzing thousands of pages of microfilm from Credit Suisse and other entities, tracking how gold and assets were moved through accounts to purchase silence and safe passage. These weren't just bank accounts, they were actually the financial arteries of the rat lines. The names being uncovered are not just the high-profile war criminals, but also the facilitators, the businessmen in Argentina who welcomed Nazi capital, and the bankers in Zurich who simply looked the other way. The treasure didn't just vanish into the ground, it was laundered into the global economy. So, where is it now? The short answer is that most of it was found, and most of what wasn't found is likely unrecoverable or was destroyed. The Nazi gold train buried near Wałbrzych in Poland, supposedly packed with 300 tons of gold, became an international media circus in 2015. Two men, Piotr Koper and Andreas Richter, used ground-penetrating radar to claim they had found it. The Polish military moved in. The world watched. They dug, and, well, they found nothing. The radar images that looked like an armored train were later determined to be, just natural geological formations. This is the pattern. For every verified cache like the Merkers mine, there are 100 legends. The search continues, even now. As recently as 2025, Polish authorities authorized a new excavation in the Pomeranian region, near Ziemiany, based on a deathbed confession from a former inmate who claimed to have information from Erich Koch, the Nazi Gauleiter of East Prussia. They are looking for a buried bunker that might hold panels from the legendary Amber Room. The lesson here for the serious student of history is about the nature of operational security. The Nazis who buried their treasure in 1945 had two advantages. First, the sheer scale of destruction. Cities like Wrocław, which was then called Breslau, were just flattened. Landmarks were obliterated. The maps and landmarks a hider would use were wiped clean by bombing. Second, they had time. The people who buried the caches were often the only ones who knew where they were. If they died on the Eastern Front, or maybe managed to flee to South America and took the secret with them, the treasure became a geological anomaly, pretty much indistinguishable from a rock formation to a radar operator 80 years later. Understanding the fate of Hitler's stolen treasures matters because it corrects a dangerous assumption. We like to think that when a bad regime falls, its resources are automatically confiscated and justice is served. But, history shows us that the fall of a regime is a messy, prolonged event. The assets don't just disappear, they are transformed. The gold that wasn't melted down and sold became the seed money for post-war survival, for escape, and in some cases for the rehabilitation of former Nazis into the fabric of post-war society. The search for these treasures isn't really about the gold, it's about tracing the DNA of the regime, understanding how its poison survived beyond its military defeat. It's a reminder that collapse is a process, not an event, and that the resources of a defeated enemy don't just vanish, they seep into the cracks of the New World Order. If you value this kind of in-depth historical analysis, looking beyond the surface-level summaries to understand the real mechanics of conflict and consequence, make sure you subscribe to War Machiner. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to understand that the war didn't end when the guns fell silent. It just went underground.